The loneliest promises are the ones no one remembers, except the soul who refuses to break them. Snow drifted across the forgotten hillside in slow, silent waves, soft enough to hide the footprints of yesterday, yet never able to erase the path she had walked for 6 winters without fail. Long before dawn painted the eastern sky with pale silver, a lone figure climbed the narrow trail through towering pines, her worn gray cloak gathering fresh snow with every careful step. The forest knew her. The restless crows no longer cried when she passed. The foxes watched without fear from beneath frost-covered branches. Even the wind seemed to lower its voice, as though honoring a ritual older than memory itself. Evelyn Carter carried no lantern because she had memorized every crooked route and every weathered stone along the mountainside. She carried only a small bundle of dried winter lilies wrapped inside faded linen and a simple wooden broom she had carved herself years ago after the old one finally split apart. By the time she reached the clearing, the first hint of morning had begun to color the clouds. There, surrounded by ancient oaks whose bare branches reached toward the gray heavens like silent guardians, rested a single grave. There was no polished monument, no marble angel, no carved name waiting to be remembered. Only a weathered stone, its surface cracked by countless freezing seasons until every letter that might once have existed had surrendered to time. Evelyn knelt anyway. She brushed away the fresh layer of snow with slow, practiced movements, revealing the rough outline beneath before carefully sweeping the surrounding earth as though preparing a royal hall instead of a forgotten resting place. Her fingers had grown red from the cold years ago, yet she never hurried. Every movement carried quiet devotion. Every breath rose into the winter air like an unspoken prayer. When the last trace of snow disappeared from the stone, she laid the faded lilies beside it and rested one trembling hand against the chilled surface. "I came back," she whispered so softly that only the wind could have heard. "Just like I promised." No answer ever came. It never had. Yet the silence never felt empty. It felt patient, almost as if someone listened beyond the veil of winter itself. Far below the ridge, smoke rose from the chimneys of Blackridge Village where warm fires chased away the cold inside crowded homes. By sunrise, the marketplace would fill with merchants, hunters, and travelers escaping another harsh season, and before long someone would notice the familiar trail of footprints leading toward the Forbidden Hill. They always noticed. They always whispered. The children called her the Grave Wolf because they claimed she spoke to ghosts hidden beneath the snow. Hunters insisted the clearing was cursed, warning newcomers never to approach after sunset. Old women crossed themselves whenever Evelyn appeared at the edge of town, convinced that misfortune followed wherever the wild Omega wandered. No one remembered when the stories had begun. They only remembered repeating them. The truth had become buried beneath rumor just as surely as the frozen earth concealed whatever rested below the lonely stone. Evelyn had stopped trying to explain years ago. It was easier to let people believe she had gone mad than to answer questions she could never betray. She rose slowly, adjusting the hood that concealed strands of pale blonde hair escaping around her face. At 20 years old, she looked younger whenever snow settled across her lashes, giving her an almost fragile appearance that fooled everyone who judged strength by appearances alone. There was gentleness in her blue eyes, but there was also endurance born from surviving endless winters with little more than determination and memory to keep her company. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the distant howl of wolves somewhere beyond the northern cliffs. Most would have hurried home. Evelyn simply closed her eyes for a heartbeat, listening. "Not today," she murmured toward the unseen wilderness. "I still have work to finish." She gathered scattered pine needles from around the grave, straightened a small circle of smooth river stones that marked its border, and quietly replaced one that had shifted after yesterday's storm. The care she gave the forgotten resting place was so precise it resembled affection more than obligation. Every pebble belonged exactly where she placed it. Every flower stem faced the same direction. Nothing about the grave suggested wealth or power, yet she protected it with a loyalty greater than kingdoms often inspired. As the morning brightened, faint hoofbeats echoed somewhere beyond the forest. Travelers, perhaps. merchants crossing the northern road before another storm arrived. Evelyn glanced toward the sound only once before lowering her gaze again. Whoever entered these woods rarely stayed long after hearing the stories. Fear was easier than curiosity. She understood that now. It had taken years to stop hoping someone else might remember. She reached beneath her cloak and removed a small silver pendant worn smooth from constant touch. Holding it tightly against her heart, she smiled with quiet sadness that never quite reached her eyes. "They forgot," she whispered to the nameless grave. "But I never will." Above the clearing, fresh snow began falling once again, covering the mountain in perfect white, while beneath that endless silence, an old secret waited patiently for the day someone powerful enough would finally ask the question no one else had dared to ask. Who is worthy of being remembered by a forgotten Omega for 6 endless winters? The first person to call her wild had never seen the way she whispered apologies to broken branches after gathering firewood. By the time the sun climbed above the snow-covered pines, Evelyn Carter had already disappeared into the deeper forest where no villager willingly followed. The narrow cabin she called home rested beside a frozen creek hidden beneath towering evergreens, its weathered walls leaning slightly with age, but standing firm against every winter storm that had come and gone. Smoke drifted gently from the stone chimney, carrying the comforting scent of pine and dried herbs into the crisp morning air. Inside, everything had its place. Bundles of lavender, mint, and mountain sage hung from the ceiling beams. Shelves carved from reclaimed cedar held neatly labeled jars filled with berries, roots, and healing leaves collected through every changing season. A single rocking chair faced the fireplace where a patched wool blanket rested across the arm as though waiting for someone who never returned. There was nothing savage about the little cabin. It reflected patience, quiet discipline, and the careful hands of someone who had learned to survive without expecting kindness from the world beyond the trees. Yet in Blackridge Village, no one imagined such a place existed. To them, Evelyn was simply the feral Omega. Children repeated frightening stories their parents whispered by candlelight. They claimed she could speak with wolves beneath the full moon. They insisted ravens followed her through the forest carrying messages from forgotten spirits. Some even believed winter itself lingered wherever she walked. The truth was much simpler. Evelyn rarely entered the village unless she needed flour, lamp oil, or thread to mend her worn clothing. She always paid fairly with medicinal herbs or handmade soaps, accepted whatever was offered without complaint, and quietly left before anyone could ask questions she had no desire to answer. She never argued when suspicious glances followed her. She never defended herself when frightened voices called her strange. Silence had become lighter to carry than explanations. Years earlier, she had discovered that people preferred comfortable stories over uncomfortable truths. Every rumor created another wall between herself and the world, and eventually those walls became a shelter of their own. As afternoons settled across the valley, Evelyn walked beside the frozen creek gathering fresh pine cones for the evening fire. A soft whimper interrupted the peaceful rhythm of flowing water hidden beneath sheets of ice. She stopped immediately. Kneeling beside a fallen log, she found a tiny snow hare shivering beneath tangled roots, one hind foot caught between exposed branches. Her blue eyes softened. Carefully setting aside her basket, she spoke in the same gentle voice she always reserved for frightened creatures. "Easy now. I am not here to hurt you." The little animal trembled but did not struggle. With patient fingers she loosened the branch, wrapped the hair inside her scarf, and examined the tiny paw. Nothing appeared broken, only strained. She rubbed a warming herbal balm across the swollen joint before setting the creature beside a patch of evergreen shelter. It lingered for only a heartbeat before hopping carefully into the underbrush. Evelyn smiled to herself. Moments like that asked for nothing in return, and perhaps that was why they mattered so much. As she rose, distant church bells echoed faintly from Blackridge Village, announcing the noon hour. Their familiar sound carried another reminder. Before our story continues, if you enjoy heartfelt tales filled with mystery, hope, and unforgettable journeys, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next adventure waiting just beyond the next snowfall. The bells faded into silence, and Evelyn continued toward home, unaware that several villagers stood along the southern ridge watching her from a distance. "See," one man muttered, pointing toward the forest. "She spends more time with animals than with people." An older woman pulled her shawl tighter. "She has lived alone too long. No normal Omega chooses solitude." The village blacksmith frowned quietly without answering. Years ago, before the whispers had grown so cruel, he remembered a frightened blonde girl no older than 14 bringing warm bread to an elderly widow every Sunday morning without accepting payment. He remembered her laughing beside the creek before grief settled into her eyes. Sometimes he wondered what had truly happened. Sometimes he almost asked. But every time he saw the lonely trail leading toward the northern hill, he looked away instead. Questions had become dangerous in Blackridge. Memories even more so. Meanwhile, Evelyn reached her cabin just as fresh snow began drifting through the branches once again. She paused beside the porch where several small birds pecked at scattered seeds she left every morning. They fluttered only a few feet away before returning to eat, trusting her completely. She leaned against the railing and watched the clouds gathering above the mountains. Another storm was coming. She could smell it in the sharp northern wind and hear it whispering through the ancient pines. Tomorrow the trail would disappear beneath fresh snow once again. Tomorrow she would climb the mountain before sunrise exactly as she always had. Some promises were not measured by days or years. They were measured by every choice made when no one else was watching. Somewhere beyond the endless forest, where royal banners overlooked stone castles and powerful names shaped the fate of entire kingdoms, a single forgotten memory had already begun stirring beneath layers of silence. Neither Evelyn nor anyone in Blackridge could have imagined that before another winter moon had fully risen, footsteps other than hers would finally climb the lonely hill. The storm arrived before nightfall exactly as Evelyn had expected, wrapping the northern mountains beneath thick curtains of snow that swallowed every familiar landmark beyond a few dozen feet. Inside her cabin, the fire crackled gently while shadows danced across the wooden walls. She stirred a small pot of vegetable broth hanging above the flames and glanced toward the window, where icy crystals slowly spread across the glass like delicate silver vines. Winter had always spoken its own language. Some people heard only danger in the wind. Evelyn heard memories. Every snowfall reminded her that another promise had survived another season. She finished her simple meal, set aside half for the morning, and carefully folded a fresh bundle of winter lilies before placing them beside the door. Outside, the forest settled into its peaceful silence. Deep within that silence, another journey had already begun. Far to the north, banners embroidered with a silver wolf drifted above the towering walls of Ashen Crown Keep. Warm torchlight reflected across polished stone corridors, while servants hurried quietly through the great hall preparing guest chambers before sunrise. King Cale Ashford stood alone on an open balcony overlooking the endless wilderness stretching toward the horizon. At 31 years old, he carried himself with calm confidence rather than loud authority. Snowflakes landed upon his dark cloak before melting against the warmth of embroidered wool. His silver-gray eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains where clouds swallowed entire forests beneath rolling waves of white. Most rulers measured kingdoms by castles, taxes, and armies. Cale often measured them by the people whose names never reached the royal court. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His longtime advisor, Theodore Bennett, stepped onto the balcony carrying a leather map case beneath one arm. "The southern inspection route has been prepared, Your Majesty," he said. "The village elders are expecting your visit before the next market gathering." Cale accepted the map but did not open it immediately. "Any unusual reports?" Theodore hesitated only briefly. "Nothing that threatens the crown. Only the usual winter concerns. Heavy snowfall, damaged roads, isolated farms." He paused before adding one final note. "There is also another story. It has appeared in nearly every report from Blackridge for several years." Cale finally looked toward him. "Go on." Theodore cleared his throat. "The villagers speak of a young Omega living alone beyond the northern woods. They call her the Feral Omega. Some believe she protects an abandoned grave hidden somewhere in the mountains. Kale raised one eyebrow with quiet curiosity. Protects it from whom? Theodore offered a small shrug. No one seems to know. Some say she is guarding treasure. Others claim the grave belongs to a forgotten outlaw. The oldest villagers simply advise strangers to stay away from the hill. Kale smiled faintly. Interesting how fear always fills empty spaces with stories. Theodore nodded. Would you like the Royal Scouts to investigate? Not yet, Kale answered after a thoughtful silence. A lonely grave is hardly a royal concern. Even as he spoke those words, something about the story lingered unexpectedly in his thoughts. Why would someone return to the same forgotten place through 6 unforgiving winters if nothing remained there except stone and snow? Devotion without witnesses was rarely meaningless. Back in Blackridge Village, the evening gathering inside the small tavern grew louder as neighbors escaped the freezing wind. Wooden mugs rested upon rough tables while the fireplace filled the room with welcome warmth. Predictably, conversation drifted toward the mysterious woman living beyond the forest. I heard she walks barefoot through snow, one traveler claimed confidently. Another shook his head. No. My cousin saw wolves following her last winter. An elderly farmer quietly stirred his tea before speaking. You are all asking the wrong question. The room gradually fell silent. The strange part is not that she visits the grave, he continued. The strange part is that no one alive remembers who lies beneath it. A young merchant laughed nervously. Perhaps there is no one buried there at all. The farmer slowly looked into the fire. Then why would someone spend 6 years keeping it beautiful? No one answered. Outside the tavern, snow continued falling beneath a pale moon hidden behind heavy clouds. Far beyond the village lights, Evelyn rested peacefully inside her small cabin, completely unaware that the story surrounding her had begun traveling farther than ever before. Rumors often faded like footprints after fresh snowfall, but occasionally one reached the ears of someone willing to question what everyone else accepted without proof. Before dawn, King Cale Ashford would begin riding south toward Blackridge for reasons entirely unrelated to forgotten graves, mysterious omegas, or old promises buried beneath frozen earth. Neither of them could possibly know that the road leading through the quiet forest was already guiding 2 separate lives toward the same unanswered question, one that had waited patiently beneath falling snow for far longer than either of them had yet imagined. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel, and the storm that had blanketed the northern wilderness through the night left the world wrapped in flawless white. Every rooftop in Blackridge Village shimmered beneath fresh snow, while the forest beyond stood silent, as though holding its breath. Long before most homes stirred awake, Evelyn Carter stepped onto the narrow trail once again, her gray cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders and a fresh bundle of winter lilies resting carefully in her hands. The cold nipped at her cheeks, yet her pace never slowed. The familiar climb required no thought. She knew every bend, every weathered stone hidden beneath the snow, every pine whose branches stretched across the path like faithful sentries. Somewhere behind her, the first church bell echoed softly through the valley, but its distant sound faded beneath the whisper of falling snow. At nearly the same hour, a line of mounted riders entered Blackridge from the northern road. Their horses moved with calm discipline rather than hurried force, their dark cloaks carrying the silver wolf crest of the crown. Villagers paused from sweeping porches and unloading wagons, lowering respectful heads as King Cale Ashford guided his horse through the center of the quiet settlement. He acknowledged each greeting with an easy nod, preferring sincere conversation over grand ceremony. Children peeked from behind fences with wide eyes while merchants straightened their market stalls, eager to make favorable impressions during the unexpected royal visit. Theodore Bennett rode quietly beside the king, unfolding a leather map as they approached the village square. The Elder Council has prepared a gathering after midday, he explained. They hope to discuss the damaged bridge, the winter grain supply, and the northern trade route. Cale accepted the schedule with little comment before glancing toward the tree line rising beyond the last cottage. And the hill? Theodore looked up. The one from yesterday's report? Cale nodded once. Theodore lowered his voice. Still untouched. None of the villagers go there unless necessity leaves them no choice. Before Kale could answer, an elderly woman carrying a basket of bread stepped carefully across the snowy street. She recognized the royal crest and offered a respectful bow. "Welcome to Blackridge, Your Majesty." Kale smiled warmly. "Thank you. Your village seems peaceful despite the weather." The woman's expression softened before a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Peaceful enough, except for old stories that refused to disappear. Theodore exchanged a knowing glance with the king. "Stories about the young woman in the forest?" the advisor asked gently. The woman sighed. "People speak too much. They always have. I only know she has never harmed anyone." Another villager nearby quickly interrupted. "She is strange all the same. Every snowfall she disappears toward the northern ridge before sunrise. Nobody knows why. Has anyone ever asked her?" Kale questioned. The man hesitated. "Not really. Most prefer to keep their distance." The king thanked them both before continuing through the village, but the conversation lingered in his thoughts. It was remarkable how confidently people described someone they barely knew. Rumor had painted a portrait more vivid than truth ever seemed to require. High above the village, Evelyn reached the familiar clearing. Fresh snow had nearly erased every trace of yesterday's careful work, yet disappointment never touched her face. She simply knelt beside the weathered stone once more, gently sweeping away the white blanket covering its surface. Tiny snowflakes settled across her pale blonde hair as she carefully placed the winter lilies beside the grave and straightened the circle of smooth river stones surrounding it. The storm was stronger this time, she whispered with quiet affection. "But I made it back." A soft breeze drifted through the ancient oaks, stirring loose snow from the branches above. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the peaceful hush that always seemed to settle around the lonely hillside. Then something unusual reached her ears. Far below, barely carried through the trees, came the distant rhythm of horses moving across frozen ground. She opened her eyes and glanced toward the southern slope. Travelers often crossed the valley road, but few ventured anywhere near this forgotten place. After a thoughtful pause, she returned her attention to the grave. Whoever had entered Blackridge had their own destination. Her promise remained unchanged. Down in the village, Kale finished meeting with the elders far sooner than expected. As Theodore organized the remaining documents, the king's gaze wandered once again toward the forest rising beyond the rooftops. Curiosity had begun as a passing thought. Now it settled quietly beside him like a question unwilling to leave unanswered. "I would like to walk for a while," Kale said calmly. Theodore looked surprised. "Into the northern woods?" "Only for fresh air," the king replied with a faint smile. "Sometimes the quiet tells us more than reports ever can." Without ceremony, Kale stepped away from the village road and toward the snow-covered forest where two separate paths, shaped by years of habit and destiny alike, had been slowly drawing closer with every passing winter. The forest seemed to recognize that something unfamiliar had entered its quiet heart. Snow slipped from the pine branches in soft whispers while King Kale Ashford followed the narrow trail at an unhurried pace, leaving his horse tethered near the edge of the woods. He had insisted on walking alone, much to Theodore Bennett's concern. The deeper he traveled beneath the towering evergreens, the more distant the village became until the only sounds remaining were the steady crunch of boots against fresh snow and the gentle sigh of the winter wind. It was peaceful in a way few royal roads ever were. There were no banners, no formal greetings, no endless petitions waiting to be answered. Only silence. Then he noticed them. A second trail of footprints stretched ahead of him, light and graceful, untouched by anyone else. They had been made only a short while earlier. Whoever had walked this path knew exactly where they were going. Kale slowed instinctively, not wishing to disturb the quiet rhythm of the place. The footprints climbed steadily toward the northern ridge before disappearing around a cluster of ancient oaks. At the same moment, Evelyn Carter finished replacing the final smooth river stone surrounding the weathered grave. She brushed a few loose snowflakes from the faded flowers and stood quietly, studying the peaceful clearing with the familiar satisfaction that came from keeping another promise. Everything looked exactly as it should. The stone rested straight. The flowers faced the morning light. Even the little circle of evergreens surrounding the resting place appeared untouched by the night storm. She drew a slow breath and prepared to leave when a faint sound reached her ears. Not wolves. Not birds. Footsteps. Human footsteps. They were careful, almost hesitant, unlike the hurried movements of curious villagers. Evelyn turned toward the trees without fear, only quiet caution. Through the drifting snowfall, she caught the silhouette of a tall stranger emerging between the pines. His dark winter cloak blended naturally with the forest shadows, while silver light reflected softly from the clasp resting across his shoulder. Although she did not recognize him, there was something calm about the way he carried himself. He stopped several yards away, making no effort to move closer. His gaze shifted from the weathered grave to the bundle of winter lilies resting at its base, before returning respectfully to Evelyn. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence felt strangely comfortable rather than uneasy, as though the forest itself expected patience before words. Finally, Cale offered a small nod. "I hope I have not disturbed your morning." Evelyn studied him for a heartbeat. Few strangers ever apologized before asking questions. "The forest belongs to everyone," she answered softly. "You did not disturb anything." Her voice carried neither warmth nor suspicion. It simply stated the truth. Cale glanced once more toward the lonely stone. "I have walked many roads through my kingdom," he said gently. "I have seen family cemeteries, royal memorials, and old shrines hidden by time. I do not think I have ever seen a place cared for with such devotion." Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the grave. "Someone should remember." The simple answer lingered in the cold air. Cale expected more, yet somehow understood that pressing further would only close the conversation. Instead, he looked around the clearing. Ancient oaks surrounded the resting place like faithful guardians. Small evergreen branches had been carefully arranged to shelter the stone from harsh winds. Nothing here suggested wealth or importance. Everything suggested love. "Does anyone else come here?" he asked after another quiet pause. Evelyn slowly shook her head. "Not anymore." "Family?" She hesitated only briefly before replying. "A promise." Cale found himself unexpectedly moved by the quiet certainty in her words. There was no bitterness in her expression, no desire for sympathy, only peaceful determination that had survived many lonely winters. Before he could continue, distant voices echoed faintly from somewhere below the ridge. Several villagers had ventured into the lower forest searching for firewood, their conversations drifting upward with the wind. Evelyn instinctively stepped back from the clearing. Years of avoiding unnecessary attention had become second nature. "You should return to the village," she said calmly. "People will wonder where you have gone." Cale noticed the way she avoided mentioning herself entirely, as though being discovered mattered far more to her than meeting a stranger. "And you?" he asked. A faint smile touched her face for the first time. It was small, almost fragile, yet genuine. "I always know my way home." Without another word, she gathered her empty basket, adjusted her gray cloak, and disappeared quietly between the snow-covered pines with such natural grace that within moments the forest had hidden every trace of her except the delicate footprints she left behind. Cale remained standing beside the forgotten grave long after she had vanished from sight. He looked once more at the weathered stone whose faded surface revealed no name, no dates, and no explanation. Yet somehow it no longer felt abandoned. Someone had loved the person resting beneath that quiet earth enough to return through every storm, every winter, and every lonely sunrise. As the gentle snowfall continued, Cale found himself asking a question that had not appeared in any report, rumor, or village story. It was not who the young woman was. It was who could possibly deserve such unwavering loyalty. Some questions refuse to disappear once they have found a place inside the heart. King Cale Ashford carried only one with him as he descended the mountain trail. He had expected to find an abandoned clearing shaped by old superstition, yet what he discovered instead felt carefully preserved by quiet devotion. The image remained vivid in his mind. A nameless grave. Fresh winter lilies. A circle of smooth river stones arranged with remarkable care. And a young woman whose calm blue eyes held no trace of fear, only the steady peace of someone honoring a promise that mattered more than being understood. By the time he returned to Blackridge Village, the afternoon sun had broken through the heavy clouds, scattering pale ribbons of light across the snowy rooftops. Theodore Bennett immediately noticed the thoughtful silence following the king. "Did the walk clear your thoughts, Your Majesty?" he asked while gathering the final reports from the village elders. Cale removed his gloves slowly before answering. It raised more questions than it answered. Theodore recognized the tone. The king rarely became interested in rumors unless he sensed something genuine hidden beneath them. "Did you meet the woman?" Cale nodded once. "She was nothing like the stories." Theodore smiled faintly. Rumors usually say more about those repeating them than about the person they describe. The king glanced toward the northern ridge visible beyond the village square. She never asked for anything. She never tried to explain herself. She only cared that the grave remained undisturbed. Theodore folded another document before speaking again. "Would you like me to request the village records?" Cale considered the suggestion for a moment. "Yes," quietly. "I want to know who first owned that land and whether anyone remembers the burial." The request surprised the village clerk, who disappeared into a storage room lined with dusty shelves and aging wooden chests. One by one, old ledgers appeared across the council table. Property maps, harvest records, birth registries, tax rolls. Decades of careful handwriting filled yellowed pages whose edges had grown fragile with age. Theodore searched patiently while the king turned each page himself, refusing to rush through forgotten names. Hour after hour passed beneath the warm glow of oil lamps. Yet every document seemed strangely incomplete. The northern hill appeared on the oldest maps, but the tiny clearing itself carried no official marker. Ownership shifted repeatedly between neighboring families until, nearly 20 years earlier, the records simply stopped mentioning that small piece of land altogether. "That is unusual," Theodore observed quietly. "Land rarely disappears from legal records." Cale traced one faded line across the map with his fingertip. "Unless someone wanted people to stop looking." The clerk frowned thoughtfully. "There is one person who may remember more than these books." "Who?" Cale asked. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. She is nearly 90 years old now. Her family has lived here longer than anyone else. If the hill once belonged to someone important, she might know." As evening settled across the valley, a servant was sent to politely invite the elderly woman to the council hall the following morning. Meanwhile, several miles away, Evelyn Carter returned to her quiet cabin carrying a basket filled with dry branches gathered before sunset. She paused outside her door, noticing fresh deer tracks crossing the snowy clearing. Smiling softly, she scattered another handful of birdseed beneath the old oak tree before stepping inside. The familiar warmth of the fireplace greeted her immediately. She hung her cloak near the hearth, prepared a simple pot of herbal tea, and settled beside the window where she often spent the evening mending blankets or carving small wooden toys for children who never knew where the anonymous gifts came from each winter. Tonight, however, her hands remained still. Her thoughts wandered back to the stranger she had met that morning. There had been something different about him. Most visitors looked at the lonely grave with suspicion. He had looked at it with respect. Most people questioned her first. He had apologized before speaking. She did not know his name, yet she found herself wondering why someone with such quiet manners had traveled alone into a place everyone else avoided. Outside, snow continued falling gently beneath a sky filled with distant stars. The same peaceful silence settled once more across the forgotten hillside where the weathered stone rested beneath its circle of evergreens. Hidden beneath years of frost and forgotten memory, one tiny detail remained almost invisible beneath the cracked surface of the old marker. It was not a name. It was not a date. It was the faint outline of an ancient crest, worn nearly smooth by time, so weathered that no ordinary passerby would ever notice it. But somewhere within the royal archives far beyond Blackridge, The same forgotten symbol still existed inside books that had not been opened in many years, waiting for the moment when one unanswered question would finally become impossible to ignore. The oldest memories are often carried not inside books, but inside people who quietly outlive everyone else. Morning sunlight spilled across the council hall as Eleanor Whitmore stepped through the heavy wooden doors with slow, careful steps, leaning gently upon a polished walking cane that had belonged to her late husband. Her silver hair rested neatly beneath a wool bonnet, and although nearly 90 winters had softened her posture, her clear gray eyes remained remarkably alert. King Cale Ashford rose respectfully to greet her before offering the warmest chair beside the fire. "Thank you for coming," he said with genuine kindness. Eleanor smiled faintly. When a king asks an old woman about forgotten stories, she does not keep him waiting. Theodore Bennett carefully unrolled the faded property map across the table. "We are trying to understand the northern hill," he explained, "particularly the lonely grave hidden beyond the forest." The gentle smile faded from Eleanor's face. For several long moments, she simply stared into the dancing flames without speaking. Finally, she whispered, "So someone has begun asking again." Cale noticed the quiet sadness in her voice. "You know the place?" She nodded slowly. "I knew it before the stone lost its name." Silence settled over the room. Even the village clerk stopped writing. Eleanor reached trembling fingers toward the old map before pointing to the small clearing almost erased by time. This hill once belonged to the Ashwood Sanctuary. Long before Blackridge became a village, travelers stopped there to rest because an old guardian welcomed everyone who arrived hungry or frightened. He never asked whether they were rich or poor, Alpha or Omega, stranger or neighbor. Cale listened carefully. What was his name? Eleanor closed her eyes. "I cannot remember." She sounded almost frustrated by her own answer. "Not because I forgot. Because people stopped saying it." Year after year the stories disappeared until only kindness remained in memory while the name itself slowly faded away. Theodore frowned thoughtfully. "And the young woman?" "Evelyn Carter." Eleanor's expression softened immediately. "She was just a little girl when she first arrived." Cale leaned forward. "Arrived from where?" "No one knew," Eleanor replied. "She came with an elderly man who rarely spoke about the past. They lived quietly near the northern woods. The old man taught her to gather herbs, mend broken fences, care for injured animals, and above all, to keep every promise she ever made." Eleanor smiled sadly at the memory. She followed him everywhere. If he planted trees, she planted trees. If he repaired roofs, she carried nails. If he visited lonely neighbors, she carried soup. She adored him. Cale felt an unexpected warmth at the image. Was he buried on the hill? Eleanor hesitated. One winter, he passed away peacefully. Evelyn could not have been older than 14. There was almost no family left to mourn him, so only a handful of villagers attended the burial. Before the first snowfall covered the grave, she knelt beside him and made a promise. Eleanor's voice grew quieter. She said she would never let him become forgotten. The room remained perfectly still. Theodore lowered his eyes while the village clerk quietly removed his spectacles. "Did she keep returning every year?" Cale asked. Eleanor looked at him with gentle certainty. "Every single week. Through rain, spring blossoms, autumn leaves, and 6 long winters. She cleaned the stone. She planted flowers. She spoke to him as though gratitude could keep memories alive." Cale remembered the fresh lilies resting beside the weathered marker and suddenly understood that what he had witnessed was never a strange ritual. It was love expressed through unwavering faithfulness. "Then why does no one else visit?" he asked softly. Eleanor sighed. People moved away. Others passed on. Young families grew up hearing only fragments of the old stories. Eventually, the grave became another forgotten place in the forest, and Evelyn became easier to misunderstand than to know. Cale stood and slowly walked toward the frosted window overlooking the village square. Children laughed outside, while snow drifted lazily between rooftops, unaware that a quiet promise had survived longer than nearly every memory surrounding it. "You said his name disappeared," Cale said without turning around. "Was there truly nothing left?" Eleanor remained silent for several heartbeats before answering. There was one thing. Everyone looked toward her. The old man wore a silver pendant engraved with a crest I had never seen before. After he died, Evelyn tucked it beneath his folded hands before the grave was closed. Theodore exchanged a quick glance with the king. Cale slowly turned back toward the elderly woman. Can you describe the crest? Eleanor frowned as though searching through distant years. A rising moon surrounded by oak leaves. Very old. Very carefully crafted. The words settled over the room like falling snow. Cale's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Somewhere deep within his memory, from lessons studied as a child inside the royal archives, he had seen that forgotten symbol before. He simply could not remember where. That night sleep refused to visit King Cale Ashford. The image of the weathered crest remained fixed in his thoughts long after every candle inside the council hall had burned low. He knew he had seen the symbol before, not upon a battlefield or inside a noble family's banner, but somewhere older, somewhere preserved far from ordinary memory. Before sunrise, he ordered the royal carriage prepared, not for the capital itself, but for the small archive monastery that stood halfway between Blackridge and Ashen Crown Keep. The monks who guarded its library had spent generations preserving records that even the royal courts seldom requested. Theodore Bennet rode beside him through the quiet winter morning, saying little as the horses crossed frozen streams and winding forest roads. He recognized the familiar expression upon the king's face. Whenever Cale believed a forgotten truth deserved to be uncovered, he pursued it with unwavering patience. Several hours later, the monastery appeared beyond the pines, its stone walls dusted with fresh snow while bronze bells echoed softly across the valley. Brother Alden, the elderly keeper of the archives, welcomed the visitors with warm bread and steaming herbal tea before leading them through endless shelves filled with carefully preserved scrolls, maps, and illuminated manuscripts. Cale described the crest as Eleanor Whitmore had remembered it. A rising moon surrounded by oak leaves. The old monk paused thoughtfully before disappearing into a narrow corridor lined with locked cabinets. Minutes stretched into silence until he returned carrying a leather volume whose faded cover bore no title. Dust drifted through the sunlight as he gently opened its brittle pages. Dozens of forgotten family crests filled the manuscript, each accompanied by careful notes written centuries earlier. Theodore turned one page after another until Brother Alden quietly placed his finger upon a single illustration. The room fell completely still. There it was. A silver crescent moon rising behind a circle of oak leaves, drawn exactly as Eleanor had described. Cale felt his heartbeat quicken. Beneath the illustration appeared only 3 carefully written words. House Everhart. He frowned slightly. The name stirred distant childhood lessons, but remained frustratingly incomplete. Brother Alden continued reading from the faded script. House Everhart served as the royal guardians of mercy during the earliest years of the Northern Kingdom. While other noble families protected borders with armies, the Everharts traveled the realm offering sanctuary, healing, and refuge to travelers, widows, orphaned children, and anyone abandoned by war or famine. They were entrusted personally by the crown because they carried no ambition for power, only devotion to the people. Theodore looked up in surprise. I have never heard of them. Brother Alden nodded sadly. Very few have. Their line disappeared generations ago after a devastating winter plague. Most believed the family had become extinct. Cale continued reading until another sentence caught his attention. Every heir of House Everhart carried the silver moon crest, and every guardian swore an unbreakable oath that no soul seeking shelter would ever be turned away. The words echoed strangely inside his heart. Shelter. Kindness. A lonely sanctuary hidden beyond the northern forest. Suddenly Eleanor's memories no longer sounded like village folklore. They sounded like fragments of forgotten history. Is there any record of the final guardian? Cale asked quietly. Brother Alden searched several additional pages before shaking his head. Only one unfinished entry. He slid another fragile document across the table. The ink had faded badly, yet several lines remained readable. The final guardian departed the capital under royal instruction to establish a sanctuary near the northern frontier. Further records unavailable. Cale exchanged a thoughtful glance with Theodore. Near Blackridge, Theodore whispered. The king nodded slowly. As the pieces began fitting together, one question grew larger than every answer they uncovered. If the old man who had raised Evelyn truly belonged to House Everhart, why had he been buried beneath an unnamed stone instead of being remembered as one of the kingdom's greatest servants? Meanwhile, far away beneath the quiet pines, Evelyn followed her familiar routine without knowing that forgotten history had finally begun awakening. She gathered fresh herbs beside the frozen creek, smiled as a family of deer cautiously crossed the snowy meadow, and returned home carrying enough firewood for several days. Later that afternoon, she climbed the northern hill once again, replacing flowers whose petals had frozen beneath the morning frost. Kneeling before the weathered stone, she rested one hand gently upon its cracked surface. Someone remembered you today, she whispered with a soft smile she could not fully explain. I do not know why, but somehow it feels different. A light breeze stirred the evergreen branches overhead, carrying snowflakes slowly across the silent clearing. For the first time in many years, the forgotten hill no longer felt entirely alone. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Truth had begun walking toward it one careful step at a time. The journey back to Blackridge felt shorter than the one that had led King Cale Ashford away from it, although the snow-covered roads had not changed. What had changed was the weight he carried within his thoughts. The forgotten crest was no longer merely a curious symbol carved into fading memory. It belonged to a family that had once stood beside the crown, serving not through conquest, but through compassion. Somewhere between the silent monastery and the quiet northern hill, an uncomfortable realization began taking shape. If House Everhart had truly vanished from history, then someone had allowed that history to disappear. The omission felt too complete to be an accident. By late afternoon, the royal party returned to Blackridge, where smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys and children chased one another across the village square. Everything looked ordinary, yet Cale now viewed the peaceful settlement with entirely different eyes. He asked Theodore to quietly gather every remaining local document that mentioned the sanctuary, the northern ridge, or the elderly man who had raised Evelyn Carter. The search lasted until evening. Most pages revealed nothing beyond weather reports, crop records, and property boundaries, but hidden inside a small ledger belonging to a former village steward, Theodore discovered a single folded note tucked between two brittle pages. The ink had nearly vanished, yet one sentence remained legible. By order of the Provincial Council, all references to the old sanctuary are to be transferred to the capital for preservation. Local copies shall be removed. There was no explanation, no official seal, no signature identifying who had given the order. Only silence where answers should have been. Cale carefully folded the note and slipped it into his satchel. Someone erased the memory before the people could pass it on, he said quietly. Theodore nodded with growing concern. Then the old man Evelyn buried may have carried far greater importance than anyone realized. Or than anyone wished others to realize, Cale answered. Outside, evening settled gently across the valley as fresh snow began drifting from the darkening sky. While the village lamps flickered to life one by one, Evelyn finished preparing another basket for the following morning. She replaced wilted flowers with fresh winter lilies she had carefully protected inside her cabin, wrapped a clean cloth around the wooden broom she always carried, and added a tiny bottle of oil used to preserve the weathered stone during the harshest weeks of winter. Every object rested in exactly the same place it had occupied for years. The routine never changed because the promise never changed. Before sleeping, she reached into an old cedar chest beneath her bed and lifted a small carved wooden box whose smooth edges had been polished by countless gentle hands. She opened it slowly. Inside rested only a faded wool scarf, a tiny pressed wildflower, and a simple parchment folded so many times that its corners had become soft with age. She did not unfold it. She never needed to. She already knew every word written upon it. Smiling quietly, she touched the box with affectionate fingertips before returning it to its place. "Tomorrow again," she whispered into the peaceful room. Just like always. Dawn arrived beneath a pale winter sky. As expected, Evelyn climbed the familiar trail before sunrise. The forest welcomed her with its comforting silence, but something felt different long before she reached the clearing. Fresh footprints already crossed the snow. They did not belong to wandering hunters or curious villagers. They were measured, respectful, and stopped several feet before the weathered stone. Evelyn's heart quickened slightly as she entered the clearing. King Cale Ashford stood alone beside the grave, his gloves removed despite the cold. He had not touched the flowers. He had not stepped inside the circle of smooth river stones. Instead, he waited quietly with his head slightly bowed, as though honoring a place he still did not fully understand. Hearing her approach, he turned and offered the same calm smile she remembered from their first meeting. "Good morning," he said softly. Evelyn looked from him to the untouched grave and noticed something unexpected resting beside the lilies. A fresh evergreen wreath woven by careful hands. "You brought this?" she asked. Cale nodded. "I thought no one who had been remembered with such devotion should greet another winter without one more person honoring that memory." Evelyn remained silent. The simple gesture seemed to leave her searching for words she rarely needed. After a long moment, she knelt beside the stone and carefully placed the wreath next to the flowers. "Thank you," she whispered, not only to the king, but perhaps to the quiet soul resting beneath the frozen earth as well. Cale watched the expression on her face soften in a way he had not seen before. There was still sadness, but now it shared space with quiet relief, as though the burden of remembering no longer rested entirely upon one pair of shoulders. Snow drifted gently between the ancient oaks while the two of them stood together without speaking. Neither realized that the forgotten history connecting the lonely grave to the crown was only one part of a far greater truth still waiting beneath layers of time, and that the next answer would not come from forgotten books or fading maps, but from the promise Evelyn had faithfully protected every single day for 6 unwavering winters.